Maryland Eastern Shore made a splash hire with Cleo Hill Jr., and this is the exact type of coach that Maryland Eastern Shore needed for the situation they're currently facing. Oh, yeah, it's locked on HBCU. Play my music.
You are Locked On HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? I can't help about when I listen to the new theme song. I love it. I love it. I love it. But what's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I, of course, am Darian Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald Sports editor and current contributing writer at USA Today's Saints Wire. Thank you for going on this journey with me. Make a Locked On HBCU your first listen of the day, every day. And remember, just because the mic cuts off does not mean that the journey is over. Just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Starts with an S and ends with an S. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Go to FanDuel.com/locked on to make every moment more. And right now, new customers will get $150 back in bonus bets when they put down a $5 winning bet at FanDuel.com/locked on. We wrap up today's episode with a look at the quick exit that Grambling made in the NCAA baseball tournament, even though they got the, and I use this term lightly, very loosely, most advantageous setup in the second round that they could have possibly wanted. But we kick it off with a two-part feature. Y'all know I love my double feature films, right? We're going to first look at the splash hire that is Cleo Hill Jr. to Maryland Eastern Shore, and then we'll go into the second episode, or excuse me, the second segment of the episode, and we will look at not only the impact that is going to bring upon the Hawks, but then also the impact is going to have on his former school, Winston Salem State University, but then also just go over Cleo Hill Jr.'s resume, because I don't want to do that in segment one. I specifically want to look at this angle of the hire, and that's that Maryland Eastern Shore needed a coach like Cleo Hill Jr. Last time that we spoke about Maryland Eastern Shore's job vacancy in men's basketball, I asked the question, what do you do? How do you establish a winning culture, right? That was the question, because I think this was about 2 weeks ago, or maybe it was about a month ago. So we were looking at the beginning of May, and we were looking at the men's basketball vacancy for Maryland Eastern Shore. And I asked the question straight up, and I didn't have the answer at the time. How do you build a winning culture at somewhere that never had a winning culture? And now, I mean, the obvious answer is you hire somebody like Cleo Hill. It's really duh when you finally have it in front of you. I just didn't think they could do something like that. Of course, establishing or hiring an established head coach would help. Of course, that would help. That's always going to be beneficial. But it's not always as easy. You got to understand that Maryland Eastern Shore is a job that is looked at as very difficult. Is in very difficult jobs, a lot of times are not very attractive jobs. Okay. Because I'm not saying people are afraid of work, but a lot of times they want to go somewhere where a foundation is set. A lot of times people want to go somewhere where they aren't starting from scratch. And that's okay. Of course, you want to go to the best job. Nobody goes into the NFL and says, let's take Nick Saban. Wow, that's a terrible example because Nick went to the NFL. But let's just use Nick Saban in theory, right? Or Coach K. Coach K never went to the NBA, to my knowledge. You take Coach K and what he did at Duke and said, we're going to put you in the NBA. Where do you want to go? I can guarantee you he's not going to go to the worst team in the NBA. Nobody wants to do that. They want to go with some sort of setup. So to be able to take a coach like Cleo Hill Jr., who is so established, has so much success on his resume, and be able to bring him in, this is exactly what you need. But when I asked, what can you do to set up a winning culture in a place that never had a winning culture, I'm going through a bunch of different things, and I never landed on grab an established coach. But that's exactly what Maryland Eastern Shore did, and we got to give them a Nori hand clap, because it's not easy to get somebody of his stature to come into a job that is going to take a lot of groundwork. It's going to take a lot of groundwork to set up where he wants to be. But another reason that this is so important is he brings culture. I'm sitting here saying that they don't have no culture of winning. He brings the culture. So now that's kind of like out of your hands if you're Maryland Eastern Shore. Now, in a way, you're sitting here and you're thinking, well, I don't have to have this history because I have a coach who has the history. I can sell the coach. I don't have to sell the school. I can sell Cleo Hill Jr. This is a person who is literally royalty in HBCU basketball. When you look at what he was able to do with North Carolina Central, you look at what his pops was able to do. His dad was the first ever HBCU player drafted in the NBA draft. So decorated player in Winston Salem State history. This is just a really strong hire. But I want to go in and I want to look at the three things that I believe he really brings to the table that are going to help him. One of the reasons, the three reasons I would say that Cleo Hill Jr. is the exact type of coach that Maryland Eastern Shore needed is because he brings culture, he brings stability, and he brings history, right? Let's go through that because I'm saying these are a lot of things that Maryland Eastern Shore was lacking. The reason that Cleo Hill Jr. is the perfect type of coach to go to Maryland Eastern Shore is because he brings what Maryland Eastern Shore is lacking to the table. He brings culture, he brings history, he brings stability. Those are three things that I can't necessarily say that Maryland Eastern Shore had coming into the season. I can't say that. So let's look at culture and history together because I think that, also before we go in, every team has a culture. Let's be very clear. Every team has a culture. Is that culture good? If it's not, we don't really recognize it as culture. We got to be 100 about it, okay? A team that is terrible and has been losing, they have a losing culture. It is still technically a culture, but you can't bring a new coach in and say, hey, this is kind of how we do things. You're still, even if you're going to allow that coach to mold his own team, you can't say this is kind of how we do things because you've never done it and won. The only culture that we really care about is winning culture. So when you apply this to Coach Hill, now he has a culture and a history. So I'm going to combine those two because the culture has led to winning, and he has done this repeatedly, which you can say now is a history. So when Cleo Hill Jr. steps into the room, he's going to say, this is how we did it at Shaw. This is how we did it at Winston-Salem. Yes, you're going to have questions about can he do it on the D1 level, but you can sit here and tell him, do what you do, take care of our program, and we're going to see how it goes. That's a culture of we did this and we won. We practice a certain kind of way. This is how we prepare ourselves for big moments because the psyche of a big moment may be different when you go on different levels, right? Like a high school championship game is likely different than a Super Bowl. It's just likely different. You can play in a bunch of high school championship games. It may not prepare you for a Super Bowl, but the process that you go to being ready for the moment is likely very similar. It's probably very similar as far as how you prepare mentally to not have the moment be too big for you. I'm going to leave on that topic and move on to stability. When you come to stability, I think this kind of lends the amount of leash that he'll have. It's going to be a lot. Cleo Hill Jr. will not be treated like Coach Crafton. I do not like the way that Coach Crafton was. I don't like how they departed, okay? Because if we're just speaking from a basketball standpoint, he had the best season in Maryland Eastern Shore D1 history 2 years ago. 1 year ago, bad season. This offseason, he's hurt. He's out. So it's only been one season since he gave y'all the best year as a D1 school. I'm not a fan of that. I think he had earned more, especially when you didn't have a lot of history going. So I would try to see if he can get back to what he did in 2020. What? That'll be 2022, 23. So in that 23 season, I will see if he could get back to that. I'm not having to worry about that with Hill. First of all, I think he'll have more consistent success. But even if he doesn't, even if he has an off year, maybe if it takes a while to get things going, he's not going to be discarded quickly. He's not somebody of his stature, not somebody of his resume, not somebody of just his class. I don't expect that to be a quick departure. If it is, that means it's something likely more than basketball. Like, that's just real. If he's gone quickly, this is not a basketball issue. That is my projection, but I also don't think he'll be gone quickly. So we don't really have to go there. He has a history in a CIAA. I want to see what he can do in the MEAC. It's a completely different conference. It's a different subdivision. There are a lot of differences between the CIAA and the MEAC. So I need to now see how does he make that transition, because that is something that we really need to look at. But what I do know is that he'll be a stable force as soon as he enters the gym. He'll be a solid presence as soon as he meets the team. He'll be a leader that is easy to buy into because you know he has a history. You know that he has a culture. And if you can't listen to him say, this is how we're going to practice, this is how we're going to operate, this is how the team is ran, that's on you. Yes, you could say that for most coaches, but I think specifically when you achieve more, you earn more respect. That's not a deep concept, and it's one that's easily applicable here. He's done too much for you to not be a willing follower, in my opinion. I do not believe that he should have to win people over to a large degree. I hope that makes sense on why I add to a large degree, because I know it's there, but not overwhelmingly, in my opinion. Now, as you push forward, let's look at the impact of this hire and then also look at his resume, because I want to break down some of the things. I just thought that this angle was the one that should take precedent. So let's do that. Let's do everything else as we continue with Locked On HBCU. As we continue rolling on today's episode of Locked On HBCU, today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. And LinkedIn is the number one place for all of my small business owners. So if you're a small business owner and you're not on LinkedIn, I'm quite confused on what you think you're doing. This is not the move. You have to make sure that you are properly prepared for any void to be filled immediately. And LinkedIn is the place to go for that. See, you might not expect the person in accounting to say, hey, yeah, I got to go. But once they say they do, you know, you go to LinkedIn and you can find somebody who can replace him or her to a similar, if not greater degree. Over 80% of small businesses who looked at LinkedIn.com/LockedOnCollege were able to find the right person for their job for free within the first day. That's 24 hours, and you're able to find the right candidate to fill your void. Go ahead and make that percentage go even higher. All you have to do is go to LinkedIn.com/LockedOnCollege. That is LinkedIn.com/LockedOnCollege. As we continue rolling on today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day. For your second listen, make sure you're checking out Locked On Sports today. It's the first of its kind live 24/7 live stream on YouTube. So go to Locked On Sports today and subscribe right now. Cleo Hill is now the Maryland Eastern Shore men's basketball coach, but just a couple of days ago, he was the Winston Salem State men's basketball coach. So I want to kick this off with the impact before we go look at his resume, not only at Winston Salem State, but then also at Shaw University. So as we kick it off with the impact, I think that I made it pretty clear with Maryland Eastern Shore what the impact is, but I'll backdoor and kind of quickly summarize it again, just for, segment purposes. But Winston-Salem State, they're looking to replace a legend. In his 6 years there, Hill achieved a high level of individual and team success that we will get to at the end of the segment. He's a legend. His dad's Cleo Hill Jr., Cleo Hill Sr. His dad is one of those guys at the school. He came and he coached. Now he's one of those guys at the school. He had his 200th win while he was at the school. This is an accumulation of everywhere he's been. But to the place you achieve something like that typically holds a strong hold on how you feel and a strong hold to that moment. And it wasn't as if he won 190 games elsewhere, came to Winston-Salem State, all he had to do was it's not like that. He had a strong career elsewhere, capped it off at Winston-Salem, and I think he'll always be remembered fondly as a Winston-Salem moment for him. That's just how I believe that'll be. I haven't talked to him about it. But forget the lifetime achievements, right? Because we talking about things he did, legend, who his dad is, 200 wins across multiple universities. Forget the lifetime achievement. This man was the coach of the year last season. I don't need no lifetime achievements. He was the coach of the year last season. So in other words, you're looking at somebody who's still at the top of their game, but he's no longer at the top of his game for you. He's now at the top of his game for Maryland Eastern Shore. So having to replace a coach like that is very difficult. I'm interested to see how, not who, but how, right? I think that's a very important thing. Who the next coach of Winston-Salem State will be, whoever the next coach is. We'll see that, right? I'm tired of saying I'm interested in who it'll be. I'm interested in how they're going to decide it, because everybody knows how I feel about interim head coaches who are decided in the offseason. I'm not in love with it. But if Winston-Salem State decided to opt for the interim role, I kind of get it. I'm not pushing for it, because I'm going to be very clear. I believe that Winston-Salem State can find a coach that they believe will lead them into the future, even though it's late in the process. But I believe you can find it if you want to. But I wouldn't be shocked if they decided they didn't want to. They would prefer to wait and have a full offseason to find a coach that they would want and have a larger pool to pick from. I can understand that. It's June now, right? Like, the way I look at it is, you often have these teams who are taking coaches from other teams late in the process. So now that team that lost a coach is already pushed back. We're looking at coaches who are getting fired in March. We're June. We're 3 months apart. So that was probably mid-March. You're 2.5 months away from when these first coaches were getting fired. The process started a long time ago. So I could understand why they would be like, you know what, I'm just going to wait until next offseason to do my due diligence. I haven't heard anything. Also, the other reason, they've been really good with Cleo Hill. I could imagine them just saying, let's run it back. It's kind of like Kyle Jackson at Bowie State football after Damon Wilson left. You know what? We're going to see if this guy can continue something. Oh, he can? All right, let's extend him. Maybe a guy like Ricky. I haven't heard about Cleo Hill taking his team or anything, his staff. So maybe you got a guy like Ricky Wilson. Excuse me. The last time that I looked at the Maryland Eastern Shore website, they still had Hill, or the Winston-Salem website, they still had Hill as the head coach. So they haven't named an interim yet. Maybe it could be somebody like Ricky Wilson. You promise him, hey, you get a chance to be a head coach. You ain't got to follow there. You can be a head coach. That's just what I'm looking at. Now, when you're looking at from Maryland Eastern Shore, the impact is you got the legend, right? Like everything that Winston-Salem lost, you gained. So I think the impact is very easily seen. You bring stability, you bring history, you bring culture. That just wraps up the three things I said at the end of the day. And I think that's what they need. Maryland Eastern Shore was in need of culture. They were in need of a coach who had a little bit of stability, and they were in need of a coach who had history of winning, which is then bringing with culture. So, yeah, so I think they get that. I think that's point blank. Now, let's look at the last two places that Cleo Hill Jr. has gone. That's Shaw and Winston-Salem State. At Winston-Salem State, Coach of the Year multiple times. He had a player who went to the G League, so you got a guy from the D2 level who was able to then move up into the NBA ranks, even though it wasn't the association. It is the G League, and you may be able to see him move his way into a two-way contract. It's just, that's impressive for a player to come from Winston-Salem State, the D2 level, and then make it on to a G League roster. You got to give him some credit for that, because that's player development. Along with player development, he's also had a player of the year for Winston-Salem State. He brought Winston-Salem State their first championship in nearly a decade. Then you look at what he did at Shaw. There was a season in which Shaw ended number 5 in the country of all D2 schools, not the 5th best HBCU, the 5th best team in the country. You know what I'm saying? They made it to the Sweet 16 in the D2 tournament. You're looking at a season where they went undefeated in conference play, something they hadn't done in 20 years. Well, overall, when you look at both of these destinations, Cleo Hill Jr. has had multiple Coach of the Years. Cleo Hill Jr. has had championships at both places, at each school, multiple championships at each school. He's had player of the years. He's been able to develop players. He's had high-level team success and individual success, like I'm saying. When you're looking at the idea of a coach of the year, very recently, as in the reigning coach of the year, the CIAA, you're looking at somebody who has put players into the NBA feeder system. You're looking at somebody who has had players be all conference player of the year. You're looking at somebody who's won championships. This is what you need. This is a great resume, and I am now excited to see what he can do in his first year at Maryland Eastern Shore. But as we navigate throughout the rest of the show, we're done with this side of it. I want to look at Grambling and look at their baseball team, because they are quickly out of the NCAA baseball tournament. I don't think it's overly shocking, but I do want to break down the path to their exit as we continue and wrap up today's episode of Locked On HBCU. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, and FanDuel is the official sports book of the Locked On Podcast Network. Now, the NBA finals are around the corner. We got 3 days left, something like that. I'm excited. Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Luka Doncic, Kyrie Irving. Who's going to be the MVP? I should check the odds tomorrow if we do this at some point before this game. Oh, by the way, we're not doing an episode tomorrow. So we're Monday, Wednesday, Friday now, just so you know. But anyway, look at the NBA Finals MVP odds. Just look at the spread for each game. The spread will probably be closer than the ticket prices. But, hey, y'all go ahead and go to Dallas. Go ahead and go to Boston. Go ahead and just vote on or bet on whoever you think is going to win that game. Make sure that you do it at FanDuel.com/lockedon. That is FanDuel.com/lockedon. If you're new to FanDuel, then you can get $150 back in bonus bets if you put down a $5 winning bet. That is FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more. As we're wrapping up today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day, making it all the way to segment 3, and I thank you 2 times for that. Grambling baseball season is over, and they went 0-2 in the NCAA tournament. Now, to me, it is unfortunate, but to me, this was the outcome we were fighting against, but it was the expected outcome. I do feel as if they had the most advantageous. It's just saying it don't feel right, but that's the best way to put it. This is the exact pattern that I wanted Grambling to have. I want to break down the path to exit and break down why I thought this was so advantageous. I did not expect them to beat Texas A&M. I just didn't. And I think I expressed that on the day. They had to be so perfect. It was too much. They did field the ball well, right? Like, they only allowed 8 runs, and I thought that was pretty decent, to be honest. I did. I thought that was solid, that they only allowed 8 runs, and 8 runs allows you to be competitive if you bat well enough. But they didn't bat well enough. So they had no runs on the day. I don't care how well or how low you keep them. If you can't score nothing, you ain't never going to win. I've never seen a team win scoring 0 in anything. Not hockey, not baseball, not soccer, not football, not pickleball, not anything. I've never seen somebody score 0 and win. It just doesn't happen, right? But then after Texas A&M, they faced off against Louisiana. So in the Raging Cajun match, now this is the one I wanted to see. I might have said it on Friday's episode. There was 4 teams in this regional, right? In this region, you had Texas A&M, you had UT, you had Louisiana, and you had Grambling. I've seen Grambling versus big schools. I'm talking before they played A&M. I seen Grambling against an Arkansas. I seen Grambling against an LSU. Those were not pretty. I didn't like it. So I didn't want to face UT. I already was like, well, you got to face Texas A&M is what it is. But I didn't want to face UT because I've seen how you performed against really big schools. So UT would have been another school on par with A&M, with Arkansas, with LSU. I wanted to drop down a little bit, and that's where Louisiana came into play. They are not as big as Texas A&M. They're not as big as UT. And this isn't just a geographical thing. They're just not as big schools. So this was kind of a drop. So I wanted that in the elimination round, and I got it. But then the other reason I wanted it specifically is I seen Grambling play Louisiana. And if I'm comparing, I'm not saying it's super close, but if I'm comparing their game against Louisiana to their game against an Arkansas or a game against an LSU, that gap was way closer and easier to close if you're looking at Grambling versus Louisiana. It was 4-12 as opposed to a 2-26 or a 1-21. The gap is a little bit easier here. So I wanted to see them play Louisiana. Unfortunately, it was pretty much the same thing as the regular season. It was 5-12 instead of 4-12. So It really wasn't that much of a difference. One thing I noticed is that when players get on base, a lot of times they're going to make it home. And that's a problem. I don't know how to fix that, but that is a problem. I've seen it mostly against Arkansas, LSU, and Texas A&M. But that was the path. It was very unfortunate. I'll tell you what the turning point for the Louisiana game is before we leave. The second and third inning. First inning scoreless, fourth inning scoreless, fifth inning scoreless. So that second and third innings, they were sandwiched in by blank innings. But in the 2 and the 3, you went 4-1, 4-1. Both went in favor of Louisiana. And now at the end of the third inning, before you even get to the fourth and the fifth, that went scoreless. At the end of the third inning, you're sitting here 8-2, and it did not feel like Grambling was going to come back. That was the turning point to me. And that was the moment where I was like, don't like those chances. I just do not like the smaller school rallying against the bigger school in anything, especially I don't care who the teams are. That's just not something I typically bank on. You want the smaller school to be ahead and protect the lead. You don't want them to have already been, even when it was 0-0, the perception was you were down. And, that creeps into those guys' heads. Now you're down 8-2. The gap may have been like here. Now it's like here, So I didn't want that. I didn't like that. And at that moment, I was like, this one's probably over. Kind of like this episode. But this one's definitely over. So I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day. But we'll be back on Wednesday. Just to be clear, we will not be here on Tuesday. I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to operate within those days that are blank. Might not be this week that I do it. Might not be next week. But I know that during the summer, we will try to find some way to not have it only be 3 shows. But if you want to make sure you catch that extra stuff, you're going to have to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusive. That's just where it's going to be. That's where the extra stuff is more than likely going to be. So I appreciate you for doing that. I appreciate you also for making this your first listen of the day every day. Until the next time that we hear each other, family, take care. Stay blessed. Peace.